I never thought a quiet suburban street could feel like a battlefield, until the HOA came knocking. One morning, I found a letter slipped under my door, demanding immediate access to my private road for reasons they refused to explain. It wasn't just a request, it was a threat, backed by fines, legal jargon, and the unnerving authority of a board that seemed to relish controlling every inch of our lives. My neighbors whispered about previous disputes, but nothing prepared me for what came next. Could I protect my home without destroying my entire neighborhood, or would standing my ground unleash chaos I couldn't contain? Life on Maplewood Lane had always been quiet. The kind of neighborhood where kids rode bikes without helmets and neighbors waved from their driveways. My mornings started with the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the open windows and the occasional chirp of sparrows perched on the oak outside. We had lived in our little corner of the cul-de-sac for nearly a decade, our home a cozy haven of laughter, weekend barbecues, and late-night stargazing. Neighbors were friendly, or at least civil. Everyone knew the unwritten rules: keep your lawn neat, your fences modest, and your complaints to yourself. For the most part, life flowed smoothly. I could park in front of my own house without a second thought, stroll down our quiet street at dusk, and trust that our private road, narrow, tucked between our yards, was ours alone. Yet, even in the calmest communities, tension simmered beneath the surface. There were whispers about the HOA, the self-appointed guardians of Maplewood Lane's aesthetic integrity. Some neighbors grumbled about petty fines for mismatched shutters, strange restrictions on holiday decorations, and letters threatening legal action over the tiniest infractions. I'd always shrugged them off, thinking, that won't happen to me. But then, subtle signs started to appear. A meeting notice slipped under our door. Friendly smiles that carried a certain tension, questions from neighbors about the road's upkeep. Nothing overt. Nothing truly alarming. Just the faintest hint that the balance of our quiet lives could be disrupted. I didn't yet know that one small, seemingly innocent HOA request would spiral into a conflict that would shake the neighborhood to its core. At first, it started with small annoyances, things I could almost laugh off. A polite but insistent note slipped under my door, reminding me that our street, technically private, technically ours, was subject to HOA guidelines, and that access must be granted for community purposes. The words felt harmless enough, bureaucratic nonsense at most, but there was a subtle edge in the phrasing, a tone that implied, do this, or else. I folded the letter carefully, shoved it into my desk, and went about my day, telling myself that our private road was our business, and surely common sense would prevail. That sense of calm didn't last long. Within days, another letter arrived. This one was more pointed, adorned with the HOA's official seal and signatures I didn't recognize. It accused me of refusing access, and warned of legal recourse if compliance wasn't immediate. There were fines attached, hundreds of dollars, accruing weekly. My stomach sank as I read the dry, impersonal threats. How could a group of neighbors wield such authority over my own property? I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting, thinking that face-to-face conversation might diffuse whatever miscommunication had started this storm. The community center smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee, and the room buzzed with an awkward tension I couldn't place. Chairs were arranged in rigid rows, and at the front, the board members sat elevated, their expressions polite but cold, like judges waiting for a trial. The meeting began with routine announcements: yard inspections, new landscaping rules, parking reminders. Then, one of the board members, The woman who had been most insistent in her letters addressed me directly. Her smile was sharp, practiced, the kind that masked glee behind civility. "We need to discuss access to the private road," she said, her voice calm but loaded with authority. "It's for the good of the community." I tried to explain that the road was privately maintained, that we had always allowed emergency access, that we had no interest in blocking anyone. My words seemed to dissolve into the air. Every argument I made was met with citations, policy excerpts, and references to vague clauses buried in documents I had never signed. My frustration mounted, but so did my resolve. I could not, would not, give in to demands that felt arbitrary and unfair. Over the next few weeks, the harassment intensified. Fines piled up, letters stacked like a small paper wall on my kitchen counter, each one more insistent, each one more threatening. One morning, I discovered bright orange violation stickers plastered on the edge of my driveway. The message was clear: my property was under scrutiny, my control under attack. I felt a mixture of anger and disbelief. How far could they go? It wasn't just paperwork anymore. There were unannounced visits. Board members or hired inspectors wandering down the road, taking notes, photographing cracks in the pavement, commenting on grass length, even measuring the width of my driveway. They didn't knock. They didn't ask. It was as if I were under a microscope, every action judged, every step second guessed. The lines between legal authority and personal vendetta blurred in a haze of officious power. Neighbors started to notice. Some offered sympathetic nods or quiet murmurs of support. Others, wary of the board's influence, stayed silent, casting suspicious glances. Rumors began to circulate about previous homeowners who had disappeared from the neighborhood after disputes, about fines so crippling they had forced sales. Each whisper tightened the coil of tension around me. I felt both isolated and determined. I couldn't let this happen. My home was my sanctuary, not a chess piece for petty bureaucrats. I began documenting everything: letters, notices, photos of the road, videos of unannounced inspections. I researched HOA laws and homeowner rights, poring over forums and legal documents late into the night. Every new letter that arrived was met with a quiet fury and meticulous counter evidence. I realized that the HOA thrived on intimidation and fear, exploiting the fact that most homeowners lacked the knowledge or courage to fight back. I was determined not to be one of them. The tension escalated further when the board sent a team to survey the road while I was at work. They arrived uninvited, cameras in hand, measuring every inch of asphalt. One neighbor, someone I had known for years, acted as if nothing unusual was happening, chatting casually with the board while I imagined the confrontation that would inevitably come. That night, I paced the living room, staring at the ceiling, imagining ways to confront them without risking legal trouble or a neighborhood meltdown. Then came the ultimatum, a formal notice demanding unrestricted access to my private road, coupled with a threat of legal action if I refused. The language was precise, cold, almost gleeful. They had found a technical loophole, something buried in a document no one had likely read. The fines now threatened to double, triple, and accrue daily. I felt the weight of weeks of harassment pressing down on me, a suffocating reminder that standing my ground would not be easy. I realized that this was no longer about a road. It was about control, power, and the absurd authority that an HOA could wield over people's lives. My anger transformed into strategy. I had to find a way to turn their rules against them, to exploit the very system they were using to intimidate me. But doing so required precision, courage, and a willingness to escalate the conflict to a point I had never imagined. Every day brought a new challenge. A neighbor posting rumors about me online, a subtle smear campaign in the HOA newsletter, a notice warning of community displeasure if I didn't comply. Each step felt like walking a tightrope, balancing legal compliance with moral conviction, frustration with strategy. I was learning their patterns, anticipating their moves, and carefully planning a counterattack that could finally tip the scales. And then, just as I thought I had mapped their next move, something happened that made it clear this dispute was about to explode. The board attempted to physically enter the private road, cameras rolling, letters of authority in hand, while I stood at the edge, documenting everything, heart pounding. Their arrogance was breathtaking, and the absurdity of it all hit me with a mix of fear and dark humor. Could I stop them? Should I even try? This moment marked the turning point. The petty harassment, the fines, the bureaucratic threats. They had all been leading to this confrontation. I realized that if I didn't act decisively, I risked losing control of not just the road, but my home, my peace, and the neighborhood's fragile trust. And yet, if I acted too aggressively, the consequences could be just as devastating. The stakes were higher than ever, and the next move would define the rest of this battle. The day of the confrontation arrived like a storm on the horizon. Heavy, charged, impossible to ignore, I knew the board planned to arrive at my property again, this time with legal authority in hand, cameras, and witnesses. They were emboldened by weeks of fines, letters, and bureaucratic harassment, convinced that fear alone could bend me to their will. I wasn't scared, not exactly, but my nerves hummed with a mix of anticipation and dread. This wasn't just about a road anymore. It was about standing up to the absurd authority of a group that had decided my life and property were their playground. I arrived early, dressed simply but strategically, phone and camera in hand, files and documents stacked neatly in the car. Every HOA letter, every fine notice, every snippet of policy I had painstakingly collected over weeks was ready to be presented if needed. I knew they had underestimated me. They assumed I would flinch, pay the fines, and comply without question. Today, I would prove them wrong. When the first car rolled onto the street, my heart skipped a beat. There they were, the self-appointed guardians of Maplewood Lane, their expressions calm but predatory, cameras ready, pens poised, documents in hand. I stepped onto my driveway and met their gaze, careful to keep my voice steady, my posture unflinching. "Good morning," I said, the words carrying more weight than I expected. They smiled, a practiced, polite mask that barely concealed their disdain. "We're here to access the private road," the same board member who had instigated this conflict said, voice crisp and confident. "We need to perform a community inspection, and you are required to comply." I held up my phone, recording. "Before anyone sets foot on this property," I said evenly, "let's review the documents and the law. I've done my homework, and so should you." Their smiles faltered slightly, but only for a moment. This was the first crack in their armor, a glimpse that I wasn't an easy target. What followed was a dizzying exchange of rules, references, and technicalities. They insisted on the authority of clauses buried deep in HOA bylaws, passages that seemed designed to intimidate anyone without legal training. I countered each point, presenting official state statutes and property law references that exposed the limits of their power. Every word was a calculated strike. I could feel my frustration and adrenaline blending into something like clarity. A precise, controlled energy aimed at dismantling the facade of authority they had built. As the minutes ticked by, tensions escalated. Cameras captured every movement. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, and the air seemed to thrum with the weight of anticipation. The board's confidence wavered, each legal rebuttal I delivered chipped away at their narrative. They attempted to interrupt, to insist, to appeal to tradition and community expectations. But I had prepared for everything. I could see the shock in their eyes when they realized their intimidation tactics were failing. Then came the pivotal moment. I reached into my folder and produced a certified letter I had obtained weeks earlier. A binding legal notice stating that the private road was indeed under my control, and that any unauthorized entry could constitute trespassing. I read it aloud, slowly, deliberately, letting each word land. The cameras captured my calm but firm voice. Neighbors outside paused in quiet awe, and the board members stiffened as if struck. "This is not just a matter of preference," I said. "This is the law. Any action to enter without permission will have legal consequences." The silence that followed was deafening. Their calculated veneer of control cracked, revealing a mix of disbelief, irritation, and, for the first time, fear. One of the board members tried to argue, waving her clipboard, but I interrupted, pointing to a clause in state law that made any unauthorized HOA entry actionable. The words hung in the air like a verdict. Cameras continued to roll, capturing the dramatic reversal. The woman's eyes darted to her fellow board members, as if silently negotiating an escape route. And then it happened. An unintentional misstep that would seal the moment. One of the board members, frustrated and flustered, attempted to step onto the road anyway, insisting that their authority granted them access. I calmly gestured to the legal notice I held, and the words left my mouth like a hammer. "Step onto this property, and you will be trespassing." Legally. Time seemed to freeze. The air was heavy with tension, neighbors peeking from windows, the cameras still rolling. The board members frozen mid-step. The absurdity of it all. How a few signatures on a letter had created weeks of terror, only to be undone by a single legal technicality. Hit like a revelation. I could almost hear the collective gasp of a neighborhood witnessing the unraveling of a carefully constructed power structure. Their reaction was a mixture of shock and indignation. They argued, pleaded, and attempted to assert moral authority, citing tradition and community benefit. But the legal facts were undeniable. Every attempt to regain control was systematically dismantled by the evidence I had gathered, the careful documentation, and the knowledge I had spent weeks accumulating. The turning point came when I calmly invited them to leave, citing the escalating risk of legal action if they persisted. Their faces were a mixture of disbelief and resignation. The arrogance that had fueled their harassment stripped bare. One by one, they retreated, muttering complaints that sounded hollow even to themselves. Cameras rolled, neighbors watched, and I felt the weight of weeks of tension finally lifting. I stood on my driveway, heart hammering, adrenaline surging, but my voice remained steady. I had not only defended my property, but also exposed the limits of a system that had thrived on fear and bureaucracy. The board's attempt to assert control had backfired spectacularly, and I could feel the satisfaction of vindication coursing through me. Yet, even in triumph, there was a lingering awareness this was only the beginning of the ripple effects. The neighborhood had witnessed the unraveling, and I knew the aftermath would be just as charged, though the balance of power had shifted decisively. As the last board member drove away, cameras still rolling, I took a deep breath, looking down the quiet street that had been the center of weeks of stress, fines, and threats. The sun glinted off the asphalt, ordinary and yet newly reclaimed. The road was mine. For now, at least. The tension, the struggle, and the absurdity of power had culminated in a single, undeniable truth: knowledge, preparation, and courage could topple even the most overbearing authorities. And just as I began to feel relief, a neighbor approached, whispering about a new rumor spreading through the HOA. One that promised that the conflict was far from over. My stomach sank again. Even in victory, I could sense that the fight had changed, evolved, and that the resolution, when it came, would be shaped by the consequences of today. I turned back to my home, heart still racing, and realized something crucial. Standing up for what was right wasn't just about winning a single battle. It was about reclaiming control of your life, your property, and your peace of mind. And in this moment, as the dust of confrontation settled, I knew that nothing, no petty rule, no overzealous board, no threat of fines, could take that away from me. But the story didn't end here. The ripple effects of this confrontation were about to spread across the neighborhood, and the consequences would be felt long after the cameras stopped rolling. The question lingered in my mind: could one person's courage really reshape the dynamics of an entire community, or would the HOA regroup and strike back in a way that no one could predict? The dust had barely settled after the confrontation, yet the neighborhood felt markedly different. Maplewood Lane, once a quiet cul-de-sac governed by unwritten rules and the heavy hand of the HOA, had become a space charged with possibility and unease alike. My victory, clear, decisive, and public, was no longer just about reclaiming the private road. It had become a statement. The board could no longer impose fear, arbitrary fines, or intimidation without consequence. In the immediate aftermath, the HOA tried to regroup. Emails circulated, polite-sounding letters were drafted, and another community meeting was scheduled. But the power dynamics had shifted. Members of the board, who had once spoken with unshakable confidence, now hesitated. Their words filtered through the knowledge that every action I could anticipate and legally counter. Some neighbors, emboldened by what they had witnessed, began to speak up during meetings, challenging petty rules and questioning decisions that had long gone unopposed. The aura of unquestioned authority the board had relied on for years was dissolving. I, too, had changed. Weeks of research, documentation, and strategy had left me not just legally prepared, but emotionally fortified. I realized how much energy we waste fearing overreach, how easy it is to be cowed by bureaucracy when intimidation is disguised as community governance. The clash had been exhausting: fines, surveillance, whispered rumors, but it had also revealed a core truth. Knowledge and preparedness are forms of power that no board, no matter how overbearing, can fully suppress. Word spread quickly through Maplewood Lane. Neighbors who had once stayed silent, too afraid to rock the boat, began approaching me with questions. How did you handle the letters? What legal steps did you take? Could we do the same? Suddenly, I was not just a homeowner defending my property. I was a guide, a living example of what one person could do against an overreaching HOA. That recognition was empowering, but also humbling. I understood that my fight had wider implications than I had anticipated. The legal battle itself had effectively ended. After the confrontation, the board backed down, retreating behind the very bylaws they had misinterpreted. The fines that had threatened to spiral into thousands of dollars were waived, and formal notices of compliance were drafted, officially recognizing the limits of HOA authority over privately maintained spaces. I retained full control of the private road. In practical terms, the conflict was over, but the social and emotional aftershocks would ripple for months, even years. For a while, the atmosphere on the street was tense but cautious. Some neighbors were hesitant to take sides openly, afraid of reigniting conflict. Others quietly expressed admiration, sharing whispered congratulations or nods of respect as we crossed paths. Even those who had supported the board quietly seemed to reconsider the risks of overreach. The community had witnessed firsthand that power without accountability is fragile, and that standing up, even when it feels daunting, can transform the balance of authority. The HOA itself underwent changes. Board meetings, once perfunctory affairs dominated by fear and protocol, became more transparent. Procedures were rewritten, fines were scrutinized more carefully, and clauses that had been exploited to intimidate homeowners were revised or removed entirely. It wasn't perfection, and some stubborn members continued to push boundaries in subtle ways, but the culture had shifted. Fear could no longer be the primary tool of governance. Maplewood Lane had learned that accountability mattered, and the precedent had been set by one homeowner's courage. On a personal level, the conflict left lasting impressions. I had spent weeks feeling cornered, frustrated, and anxious, moments when it seemed the board's relentless pressure might overwhelm me. But standing my ground changed something fundamental. I realized the value of preparation, the power of documentation, and the importance of asserting one's rights, calmly yet decisively. These lessons extended beyond my property line. They became guiding principles for navigating authority, bureaucracy, and interpersonal conflict in any sphere of life. There was also an unexpected benefit: a deeper connection with neighbors who shared similar frustrations but had felt powerless. Over time, informal discussions turned into organized conversations about community standards, fair practices, and shared expectations. The HOA could no longer operate solely as a closed, authoritarian entity. Residents began contributing ideas for improvements, suggesting reasonable policies, and openly questioning decisions that seemed arbitrary. The tension had given way to engagement, a direct consequence of the board's failed attempt to control through intimidation. Yet, the aftermath was not entirely smooth. Some board members resisted the new dynamic, creating occasional friction during meetings. Rumors persisted for months, and whispers of retaliation occasionally drifted through the street. I had learned, however, that being vigilant, maintaining records, and knowing one's rights were the best defenses against these lingering threats. The battle had taught me that victories against entrenched systems often require sustained attention, not just a single confrontation. Reflecting on the journey, I realized how absurd and petty the situation had been. The rules that had triggered this entire conflict, access to a private road, fines for imagined infractions, demands justified by vague community benefit, were minor in any other context. And yet, the emotional stakes had been enormous. Pride, autonomy, and the sanctity of one's home had been on the line. The intensity of the struggle highlighted how bureaucratic power can magnify trivial issues into personal crisis. What felt like a war over asphalt was, at its core, a war for dignity and control. The road itself, narrow, unassuming, lined with familiar trees and quietly winding between yards, became a symbol. Every step along it reminded me of the weeks of strategy, the countless letters, the confrontation, and the eventual triumph. It was ordinary and yet extraordinary, a testament to resilience and preparation, to standing firm when circumstances felt overwhelming. Each time I drove along it, I felt a quiet pride, knowing that the struggle had changed, not just my relationship with the HOA, but the neighborhood's culture of power, accountability, and respect. This experience also sparked reflection on the broader implications of HOA dynamics. Many communities operate under similar frameworks, where authority is concentrated in a small group and intimidation can be disguised as rules enforcement. Too often, homeowners accept fines, restrictions, and harassment because they feel isolated, uninformed, or powerless. What happened on Maplewood Lane demonstrated the opposite. Understanding rights, documenting interactions, and strategically asserting boundaries could shift the balance. One person's courage could ripple outward, inspiring change and challenging entrenched authority structures. Months later, Maplewood Lane settled into a new rhythm. The private road remained under my control, and the HOA had retreated into a more transparent, accountable approach. The board learned, some grudgingly, others willingly, that intimidation was no longer an effective tool. Neighborhood meetings became forums for constructive discussion rather than arenas for fear. Neighbors who had once been silent now felt empowered to speak up, and a sense of cautious respect replaced the oppressive atmosphere that had dominated the street. Looking back, I understood that the stakes had been both practical and deeply personal. The road, the letters, the fines, they were tangible. But the real victory was intangible, reclaiming agency over my own life, asserting personal boundaries, and proving that standing up against unfair systems was not only possible, but necessary. The lessons extended far beyond the property line. Preparation, courage, and knowledge could counter even the most overbearing forces, whether bureaucratic, social, or personal. As the neighborhood continued to heal, I also recognized the lingering human cost. Stress, sleepless nights, and emotional strain had been real, and the conflict had tested relationships with neighbors, some of whom had chosen sides or retreated into silence. These were reminders that confrontations, especially those involving power imbalances, carry consequences beyond legal or procedural victories. Yet even in these moments, the overarching truth remained: the experience had reshaped Maplewood Lane, proving that accountability, courage, and perseverance could alter dynamics once thought immutable. In the end, the private road became more than a path for cars and bicycles. It became a symbol of resilience, of standing firm in the face of absurd authority, and of the small victories that ripple outward into lasting change. Each drive down that stretch of asphalt reminded me that bureaucracy, rules, and intimidation could be challenged, and that fairness and courage could ultimately prevail. And as the sun set over Maplewood Lane, casting long shadows across the pavement, I realized the final lesson: conflicts may arise in the most ordinary places, over the most mundane things, yet the outcomes can redefine communities, relationships, and personal boundaries. The HOA had learned its limits. The neighbors had found their voices, and I had discovered the profound power of standing firm. So, what does this mean for anyone facing similar challenges? Could one person's careful, courageous action really change the dynamics of an entire neighborhood? Or even a broader system of authority? Maplewood Lane proved that the answer is yes. Knowledge, preparation, and resolve are tools more powerful than fear, fines, or bureaucracy. The battle may be exhausting, even absurd at times, but the triumph, when it comes, is transformative, lasting, and undeniably sweet. As I locked the gate to the private road that evening, I couldn't help but smile. The struggle had ended, but the story, the lessons, the ripple effects, the subtle shift in power, would endure. And in that quiet, reclaimed space, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: standing up for what's right is never wasted effort, even in the most absurd and frustrating circumstances.